Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Vardarajan, and joining me today for our discussion is the veteran war correspondent, foreign correspondent, Shyam Bhatia, author of Bullets and Bylines, a really riveting account of years, decades that Bhatia has spent in dangerous, exotic, exciting places and venues like Beirut, Afghanistan, the Middle East, where he was there for more than 10 years, and of course, other locales where he reported from. Shyam, welcome very much to the show.
Thank you, Siddharth, and thank you for thinking of me for today.
Well, I have read several of the chapters, and I have to confess to feeling incredibly jealous. It's not that I haven't had a reasonable career as a journalist and as an editor, but you've been through some exciting times.
There have been a few, yes.
Dangerous times too.
Yes, looking back on it, I wonder how on earth I managed to survive.
What would you single out as your most hairy experience as a foreign correspondent?
Well, I would start with the first chapter. It's about Afghanistan. I was a young reporter, and I was sent to cover the riots on the anniversary of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's death, hanging in Rawalpindi. So I was in Rawalpindi when the Soviets crossed into Afghanistan, and our staff correspondent at the time was expelled from Afghanistan. So I was the nearest. And
so you were working for the London Observer?
That's right. Yes, right. I was with the London Observer. The editor calls me in Rawalpindi and he says, would you mind hopping across the border to Afghanistan? Because our correspondent has just been expelled. We need someone there. So it was easy. It was a half-hour flight, Fokker Friendship aircraft on PIA. I flew into Kabul. First thing I see is Robert Fisk of the Times had published this wonderful story about going up to the Salang Pass and claiming he'd met a Soviet colonel who said, are you a British correspondent? And when Fisk said yes, he said, tell me, are the Beatles still alive? So Fisk's story
Which, of course, they were.
Yes. Well, Fisk's story ran on the front page of the Times. You say you're jealous of my experiences. I was envious beyond belief of Fisk's story. And I ran into him in the hotel lobby. And I said, Fisk, I don't believe you. And he said, you're like all the other lazy chaps. He said, go for yourself and see. I said, see where? He said, why don't you go to the bus station? Jump on a bus and see where you go. So I did. I took him at his word.
And how old were you at the time?
I must have been 28 or so.
Right.
So I jumped.
And that would have been your first major
yes, it was.
assignment, as it were, as a foreign correspondent?
Okay. Yeah. So I went to the bus station. I was wearing my blazer and tie, my school tie as it so happened, and polished black shoes. Good Indian boy abroad. I jumped on the first bus. I didn't speak any Pashto. I fell asleep like most people do. But half an hour later, I heard this pat, pat, pat noise. The bus had been stopped by Afghan Mujahideen, loyal to Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, and they were looking for communist sympathizers. So anyone with a red ID card was branded pro-communist, and all Afghans had red ID cards. So one by one, they took them off the bus and shot them in front of me. Bang, 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 bang. Then it came to my turn. So I was the last off the bus. They said ID. So I produced my British passport, blue and gold at that time. And
now it's red.
Now it's red. Now it's EU. Right. Or for the time being.
For the time being.
So they said, what's this? I said, British passport. He said, what are you doing here? I mean, there was an interpreter. The man who was speaking to me, there was a man who spoke a little bit of English. I said, I'm a reporter. I mean, the concept of reporter didn't enter their minds. And he went like that with his rifle butt straight across my mouth. I still have about 5 false teeth from that particular encounter. And then they said, you come with us. So they spared my life because I was a British reporter. But that's not why I survived in the end, which is very interesting for me. We ran from village to village. We were bombed by Soviet helicopters. And eventually they said to me, why don't you join us? I said, no, this is not my business. And overnight they left. Now you talk about hairy experiences. The next morning, the village headman comes to me. He says, you are Indian, he said. You are our brother. You stay. So as I stood there.
So of course there was enormous goodwill then as now.
Huge.
For India and Indians in Afghanistan.
So he said, you've had a very rough time and it's very unfair. There was a man who had a BA in English. His nephew had a BA in English from Kabul University. He said, my uncle wants to give you a gift from the village. I didn't know what he was going to do. I had no idea. He produced one boiled egg. That was a luxury for them. He said, this is for you. So I, with my missing teeth, consumed the one boiled egg of the village that evening. And I sat with them and I stayed with them. They said, why don't you stay here and become a teacher of English? So if you talk about hairy experiences, that was pretty hairy. And it didn't finish there, if I may continue.
Please, fascinating.
I jumped on they put me on a bus to Kandahar, which is the other major city across from Kabul. And I eventually fainted in the bazaar, and a Sikh businessman carried me in his arms to the home of the outgoing Indian Consul General, who's a man called Mr. Tucker. And I woke up 2 days later from my unconsciousness in the arms of Mrs. Tucker, who's feeding me soup, saying, "Puttar, puttar, kithe gaya tu?" Something like that. They put me on a plane to Kabul. I got to Kabul to my hotel, was promptly arrested by the
government.
By the government. Babrak Karmal's pro-Soviet government.
Right.
Where have you been? You have been with the opposition. I said, well, I'm a reporter. I have to be with all sorts of people. No, you are under arrest. You come and see the minister.
And you have missing teeth and everything. Right?
Everything. So I go to see the minister. He said, you are going to spend 10 years in our prison. So I said, Minister, I'm very sorry that I've caused you so much trouble, but it's my job to report what's going on. No, you're going to prison. And then I had a brainwave. On arriving in Kabul, I'd called on Mr. Teja, Ambassador Teja, India's ambassador, who, as it so happened, was also a pal of my dad's. So I said, Minister, you don't happen to know Ambassador Teja?
Your dad being the legendary Prem Bhatia, of course.
He, a journalist like myself. And he said, you know Mr. Teja? You know Ambassador Teja? Obviously, Ambassador Teja carried a lot of clout. I said, yes, I do. So in front of me, he called Ambassador Teja. Ambassador Teja sent over one of his first secretaries who got me released. And he said to me, I've got you released. You're on safe ground, but you've got to leave Kabul immediately. So the first flight out of Kabul was an Indian Airlines flight to Delhi. So I was put on that flight, arrived in Delhi, to be met by a tearful mother a few days later who took me for puja and goodness knows what else.
That's quite a baptism by fire for your first major assignment as a foreign correspondent.
Yeah, it was.
So what is it that prompted you to ask for or to be sent off on a foreign assignment? I would imagine even in those days, despite the danger, it would have been very, very coveted as a job. Was there a lot of competition in the newsroom, in the Observer?
Not really.
Why him, not me?
No, yeah. not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. You know, it's considered so far out and these obscure places, and only loonies became foreign correspondents. Yes, there was a certain amount of competition, but what people wanted were the instant assignments. You know, a weekend in New York or a week in Madrid, or maybe 2 weeks in Delhi. But the idea of sustained foreign coverage, of sitting in a place and evaluating the situation and making contacts with local leaders, that was something that was not everyone's cup of tea.
Right. And you spent a lot of time in West Asia, in the Middle East?
I did.
Based out of Cairo?
Cairo to begin with, then Beirut, and then Jerusalem.
Right. So I suppose the Israel-Palestine conflict took up a lot of your time, Israel-Syria?
Yes, it did.
Any exciting stories from then?
Well, there is one somewhat obscure story. I don't know if it'll interest your viewers. But I was sitting in my Jerusalem study one day, and the phone rang. And I picked it up, and there was this woman's voice at the other end. And she said, is that Shyam? So I said, yes. She said, this is Pinky Bhutto. I said, oh, come off it. Stop playing jokes on me. She said, no, this really is Pinky. And I was completely flummoxed.
Now, you knew her from college days?
We were friends from college.
Right.
I realized I was speaking to the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So I said, well, hi, are you coming to Israel? She said, no, I'm calling you for a purpose. I want to meet Yasser Arafat. I believe you know him. Can you arrange a meeting? So I said, well, I'll try. I'll do my best. So I happened to know Arafat. I'd reported on him many times from Beirut days. In Tunis, I'd had exclusives with him one after another. So I rang his wife, Suha. I said, Suha, may I please come and see Abu Ammar? Abu Ammar was his nom de guerre.
Yes.
And she said, well, you're welcome to come, she said, but we have a problem with the babysitter. We don't have a babysitter tonight. So I said, so? She said, well, if you're prepared to babysit for us, I'll guarantee that he sees you for half an hour. So I drove down. It was 1 hour's drive from Jerusalem to Gaza. I got to Gaza. They presented the baby to me in a pram. I wheeled the baby up and down the promenade. 4 armed Palestinians in front of me, 4 armed Palestinians behind me, and the Middle East correspondent, the Observer, wheeling the Arafat baby. Then Arafat then turned up and he said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Abu Ammar, I had a call from Prime Minister Bhutto and she wants to meet you." "Oh, tell her I can meet her in Egypt, but not here." I said, "Look, if you want to meet her or if she wants to meet you, that's your business. I've passed on the message, but I'm not going to get involved any further. I'm sure you have an embassy in Islamabad. I'm sure your representative in Islamabad can do the necessary." And I left it at that and never heard any more.
Did you find in dealing with your editors or other, the British press in general, a sense of bias in terms of how the Israel-Palestine conflict was reported or needed to be reported? Did they, in America, for example, it's quite common for reporters to come under pressure if they highlight Israeli atrocities or crimes. And there's always a manic sense in which you have to balance what Israel has done with what the Palestinians have done. Were British editors similarly inclined, or was there great freedom for you to report what you saw?
Well, I think it varied with each individual correspondent. If I can go back to the example of Robert Fisk, a very courageous and very fine journalist who has done his best to report the Arab-Israeli conflict as objectively as he can. Of course, he's hated by the Israelis and loved by the Arabs and especially by the Palestinians. But I would say one thing, that although we had no bias from our editors, and in my experience, never ever any pressure to report one side in one way or the other side in another way, most of Europe is very sympathetic still towards Israel because of what happened to the Jews during the Second World War. And everyone remembers those dreadful stories of the concentration camps where the Jews were gassed and killed mercilessly. So, of course, although the Palestinians have also been wronged and have been victims, so have the Jews. And so it's very difficult for anyone to be completely objective. You've got to take into account both sides.
But the Observer, being a liberal or even a left paper, I suppose, was quite open and sympathetic to the Palestinian point of view?
Yes, it was. Yeah. And therefore, they were very pleased. When I first made contact with Arafat in Beirut, when he was being forced to leave Beirut, and when he was good enough to grant me an exclusive interview, I wanted to meet his wife. He just got married in Tunis. So I met him in Tunis on more than one occasion. And the editors laughed because they wanted to know how I'd got the interview, because everyone had been trying to see Arafat.
Tell us something about the competition and camaraderie between foreign correspondents. You mentioned your encounter with Fisk, who of course gave excellent advice to a young foreign correspondent. You also have a fascinating story of Damascus, where you meet the other Bhutto.
Yeah, indeed, yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, there's a story about journalism over there.
Yes.
As you know, in Britain, we have very, very strict libel laws.
Yes.
So you can be sued very easily for saying the wrong thing and without backing it up.
Yeah.
I was in Damascus waiting for one of the hostages, one of the Western hostages, to be released. As you know, Western hostages were taken by pro-Iranian forces in those days called Hezbollah. And they used to be, they would capture them in Beirut and release them in Damascus. The distance between Beirut and Damascus is like the difference or the distance between Jerusalem and Gaza. It's about an hour's drive across the mountains. So there was one such hostage release, and we were sitting in the Sheraton bar. Maybe your viewers wouldn't like to hear references to a bar.
No problem.
We were sitting in this long bar, and a man comes in from the other side. And I recognized him. It was Murtaza Bhutto. He was the brother of the then Prime Minister. She just become Prime Minister. So we talk about 1988, 89.
And again, somebody that you knew from college days?
Yes, we shared the same tutor.
Okay.
Sir Michael Howard, the Regis Professor of Modern History, was his tutor and my tutor. His thesis at Oxford was about Pakistan's nuclear program. My thesis at Oxford was about the Indian nuclear program. Anyway, Murtaza comes into the room, surrounded with his friends, and I got up and I said, "Murtaza?" He pulled out a pistol and goes, "Who wants to know?" Yeah. So I was dead scared. I said, "I'm leaving." I went up to my room. He comes hammering on my door. Shyam, I'm sorry I didn't recognize you. Come down, come and drink whiskey, come and play pool." So eventually, after a lot of pressure, I went down and he started talking. I said, "Your sister has just become Prime Minister." And he started using very rude words about her. And I said, why are you being so rude about your sister? You were very friendly in college. He said, because I'm the man, I should be the Prime Minister. I said, but she's very competent and the whole world knows her. Yes, but I was my father's political agent.
And she had led the movement for restoration of democracy.
Absolutely. And a very fine person in her own way.
Yeah.
So he used a word, he compared it to a certain animal name which I'll not mention on television, and started to abuse her. And I said, is this all on the record? He said, yes, you can write what you want. Now, you ask about camaraderie. A friend of mine, Danny McGrory from the Daily Express, was in our group. He was at the other end of the room. So I called him over. I said, Danny, would you mind sitting in on this interview? Because Murtaza Bhutto is talking on the record about his sister, about the hanging of his father, and I want someone else to be witness to it.
So you had a sixth sense that you needed backup of some kind.
Libel law training.
Okay.
So we talked all night. We drank a great deal of scotch. I was there doing my long shorthand. I sent the story over to my editors who were thrilled beyond measure, exclusive from brother of Pakistani Prime Minister.
Dissing his sister, terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. Says, she's not fit to be Prime Minister. I'm the man. Very sexist. I should be the Prime Minister. The story is duly published. Everyone was thrilled. 2 weeks later, we get a letter from a lawyer saying Murtaza Bhutto denies ever giving you such an interview and wants £10 million in libel damages.
So did your editors hit the roof?
They did. They were furious. I said, I promise you I did not invent it. Here are my shorthand notes. And then I remembered, Siddharth, I'd asked my Daily Express colleague, Danny McGrory, to sit in on the interview. So I telephoned him and I said, Danny, will you return a favor? We're old friends from a long time and also comrades. He said, what? I said, do you remember that time when we were talking to Murtaza Bhutto and you kindly agreed to sit in? He said, yes, of course I remember. So I said, he's suing me for £10 million. Oh, what can I do? I said, will you write to his lawyer to say you're prepared to back me up? He said, yes. He wrote the letter. We heard no more about it. 2 years later, I ran into Murtaza somewhere. I can't remember where. And I said, Murtaza, was that really necessary? Oh, come on, Shyam, he said. Can't you take a joke?
Now, your experience as a foreign correspondent also brought you to Delhi.
It did.
And you were here in 1984 after the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi and the massacre of Indians of the Sikh faith. Tell us what you saw and what you reported.
Well, I was in my hotel room. Delhi was under curfew. There was smoke everywhere. You could see from the hotel plumes of smoke everywhere. Very hard to get around. In the middle of the night, I get a phone call saying, do you want to see some dead bodies? Well, I didn't particularly want to see dead bodies. Who does? So you can imagine my reaction. And he said, no, if you want to see people who've been killed, go to Sabzi Mandi. Now, Sabzi Mandi, as you know, is that part of Delhi which people do go to. But it's near Old Delhi, isn't it? So I jumped in a car. Very difficult to negotiate your way past the checkpoints. There were Gurkha soldiers on the streets. And we had to argue our way bit by bit. Myself, another colleague called Robin Lustig, and a photographer. So the three of us went to the Sabzi Mandi area. There was like a schoolyard and railings, and we could see little bundles, little rags. And my colleague Robin said to me, he said, Shyam, let's go, there's nothing here. So I said, no. I mean, I'm not being a hero, I'm just saying this is what normal journalists like you and I would do. I said, let's climb over and see. So we climbed over the railings, and there were actually dead bodies. And I personally counted, you'll think this gruesome, but I wanted to prove that I wasn't inventing something. I think I counted 132 bodies in rags.
Well, the official figures in Delhi, government figures of people killed are close to 3,000, so it's not surprising in the least. Yeah.
So the photographer took the pictures. We climbed back over the railings, very, very scared, because you could have been shot on sight. It was curfew. Got back to the hotel, and Robin and I said to our photographer, you better go to London with the pictures, because this is proof. We aren't being gruesome, but if the authorities say you've invented it.
And this is pre-internet, pre-television, so you have no way of knowing how the story is playing out, what's being reported, what facts are coming out. So your instincts were spot on. So you tell your photographer, fly out immediately. And what happened then?
He takes a first flight out. I don't know if it was Air India or British Airways. But he can't get on the flight. They stop him. They say, what is this film? And they insist he shows it to them, and the flight departs without him. And I get a call from the PIB in Shastri Bhavan in Delhi, the Press Information Bureau.
Yes.
And the gentleman in charge said, "Can you come over?" So I went over, and there was our photographer looking rather red-faced. And there was a PIB head. And the PIB head says to me in Hindi, "Isko samjha dijiye, iski tasveerein bahar nahi ja sakti." So I looked at him, I said, "Please don't speak in Hindi. Speak in a language that all three of us can understand, and you tell him yourself. Why are you using me as your messenger?" Well, you know he wouldn't do it.
So he was appealing to your
your
instincts as an Indian that desh badnaam ho jayega.
Exactly.
Right.
And I said, this is a story, and it must be told, and it must be told truthfully.
Yeah.
Well, the pictures never got out. The pictures never got published. And I was in the doghouse for months afterwards.
Right.
Because I had to stay on in Delhi and report the aftermath.
Right. So this was an example of someone as a reporter of Indian origin, in a way owing allegiance to this country, but determined to tell the story even if it shows something unpleasant about what happened in this country. How do foreign correspondents in general, in your experience, negotiate this tension? I mean, war correspondents, for example, reporting a conflict objectively when their own soldiers are involved. Have you encountered journalists wrestling with this dilemma?
I wouldn't say I've encountered journalists wrestling with this dilemma. I'm sure everyone has their own personal battle to wage and to win or to lose. But I think the ultimate loyalty must be to your profession. May I say something controversial on air? You know what E.M. Forster said, that I hope that if my friends had to choose between their friends and their country, that they would choose their friends. Now, you may not disagree. You may not agree with that particular sentiment, but I think as far as journalism is concerned, the truth is very, very important. And I think it's important the truth gets out. And the truth is more powerful than narrow political loyalties to this faith or that faith or for that matter, that country. I mean, I don't know what happens in war. I mean, supposing India and some other country is engaged in a war, what do you do? It's a very, very difficult situation. How do you deal with it? I think you can only answer it at that time.
But ultimately, fidelity has to be to the craft, to truth-telling.
I think so. That's what you've been trained to do, hasn't it? Yes. Because they've told us from the beginning, from when we were little toddlers and wanted to be journalists, or if we wanted to be journalists, the truth is powerful and the truth will help you. Yeah. That's why we're different from these other countries. There's Ecuador or China, or these Tiananmen Square stories, or Pyongyang in North Korea. Yeah. Isn't that makes us a great country?
Exactly. Now, Shyam, you've been through the entire cycle where the interest of global media in world news, or Western media in world news, rises, reaches a peak, and you've been in places where dozens of correspondents would have either been stationed or parachuted in to cover a particular story, to the rather abject situation today when newspapers, even well-funded ones, have cut back on their foreign bureaus, have cut back on their budgets for travel. What do you think this is doing to the world of news? That this refusal to invest in news gathering? Is it, editors or proprietors say, well, the public isn't that interested in world affairs anymore. Who wants to know? How do you, and obviously bean counters matter. Media at the end of the day has to turn a profit in order to survive. Sure. How do we strike a balance between the public's need to know and for them to, understand what's happening in different parts of the world, and the fact that this is a very costly enterprise?
It's always been a very costly enterprise, and you yourself have been a national newspaper editor, so you know exactly how costly these things are. But surely there has to be some sort of loyalty to your readers. I mean, unfortunately, modern technology has helped news in one way, but in another way it hasn't, because it's turned everyone into a journalist. Yeah. And anyone with a smartphone can say, well, I've seen such and such story. Right. But the problem with that is, and I'm sure newspaper editors must appreciate that, I hope they do, is that you have very superficial coverage. So the reason behind something happening is something that doesn't get told. Yeah. And surely the readership is sufficiently educated, sophisticated, and anxious for knowledge to be given that quality of service that they are getting less and less of. Please don't misunderstand me. I think Indian journalists are among the best in the world, but they need funding, they need backup. And I don't think they're getting that now.
Right. On that note, Shyam, we'll have to end it. Thank you so much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Indian Standard Time. We've been in conversation with Shyam Bhatia, author of Bullets and Bylines, a fascinating account of his experiences as a foreign correspondent. If you get a chance, do read the book, but thank you very much for joining us, and do come back next week when we will interview another guest. Thank you for watching.